I guess that leads me to my other big question, which I really enjoyed your video on about the demographic decline of Russia, obviously. Depopulation is one of the biggest challenges for the globe, but Russia and the former Soviet states especially, including Ukraine, to be fair. Does that play into the calculus or just situation in Russia?
Yeah, hugely. Russia has always failed to convert their competitive advantages into, primarily because their economy has been so centralized in the hands of so few people like oligarchs or czars, etc. And so they are more interested in just extracting the wealth from these systems. They don't have an incentive to innovate and create new ways of building wealth. And so that's what makes Russia especially vulnerable. Putin, for decades, has said that the demographic crisis is Russia's biggest problem. So this is not like Western propaganda. Now that they're at war with Ukraine, he seems to, probably because he's given up on it, he doesn't think it's solvable.
This is the Global Gambit.
Right now, the Ukraine war is in a state of flux, both on the battlefield with Russia's continued and heightened amount of strikes across the country, but equally diplomatically with the Trump administration really getting fed up with the Putin regime. And I say that specifically because tomorrow there is the deadline for Trump's own re-established, self-imposed, if you like, 10-day deadline for Putin to get his act together, i.e. to come to the table with a legitimate, genuine interest in peace talks. I find that still hard to believe, and indeed, it's not just myself. Most analysts or even Reuters had an article saying that Putin is just going to stick his fingers up, and that's about it. But to divulge all this with me is Paul Wahlberg, an independent geopolitical expert and creator of the Icarus Project, and someone, well, if you know Ukraine and Russia, you know Paul, because he does some incredibly good analysis and updates on it. And Paul, I'm delighted that we were able to get you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be on. Thanks for having me, Pyotr.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the very first thing really we wanted to talk about is this deadline, is the relationship of Putin to Trump and all that's going on the sort of diplomatic sphere. We'll jump, I think, into the battlefield later on as well. But what are you taking away from the sort of flurry of things we've seen in the past couple of weeks?
Well, I don't think the deadline, of course, is anything other than signaling, right? I think Trump, for whatever reason, decided he wanted to get a little bit more serious about Russia, or at least kind of project that as his new political stance. He started with that 50-day deadline and he quickly reduced it down. I don't think it's serious in the sense that anybody believes Russia is going to respond to that and actually change anything meaningful. I think it's actually rather, let's move the deadline up so that Trump can do what he wants to do, which is these sanctions against other countries that are buying Russian oil. And so that is a positive move. I mean, right, we've seen from the Trump administration since they came into office, this kind of, at the very best, if we want to frame it in the best possible terms, just an ignorance of Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine and what's going on. And now it seems possible that they are kind of finally supporting Ukraine more, or at least they recognize that it is politically expedient to signal that they're doing that, which is better than actively working against Ukraine, if that makes sense.
So you see this largely as, well, I think anyone of a reasonable mind would, that it's more about it benefits Trump's own broader agenda, foreign policy agenda and interests, than it is about trying to sort of really pressure Putin.
That seems the most likely. It's really hard to say. It's possible it's an actual pivot. There is a world in which Trump kind of had the wool pulled over his eyes and he thought certain things that he really thought he could have a conversation with Putin in the war. It seems ridiculous to us, but maybe he really thought that. And maybe he's now realizing that's not the case. They've tried to do peace talks with Russia and that hasn't worked. Everybody said it wouldn't work, but now the Trump administration has seen that for themselves. So that's a possibility too. It's really hard to judge people's motives, right? And you just kind of have to watch their actions and see how things play out over time.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I mean, one of the things that you like to do is, well, as you watch these things playing out over time, you seem to take walks. And I'm very conscious of the fact that your backdrop is not the luscious forests of the US of America. It is your homeland, so your home. So I hope people aren't too thrown from that. But to build on that specific aspect, obviously there has been this overarching deeper relationship that Putin and Trump have had in the past. The first administration was a lot more, shall we say, cushy, perhaps because Trump was a lot more naive or impressionable. And whilst he seems to still have been manipulated by Putin, he's not having it as much as Putin might have liked. So how do you look at their personal relationship at the moment? I mean, we're only, 7-8 months into Trump's administration, so...
Yeah, if you make the assumption that they had a good personal relationship and that was why Trump was doing the things he did, however you look at that personal relationship, and people interpret that in a number of ways, right? Some people say Putin has something on Trump and that's why Trump has been behaving the way he has. Some people say Trump really likes Putin for a number of reasons. He's a dictator, he's an authoritarian. People say that Trump likes that. However you interpret, though, their personal relationship, it's obviously not as good as it was a couple months ago, right? It's obviously decayed, where Trump, when he first came into office, was saying really negative things about Zelensky, calling him a dictator and things like that. And now we see the negative rhetoric turned away from Zelensky and towards Putin. So there's obviously been a shift there, which is not uncommon for Trump. When you look at personal relationships and political allies in, his first term, and we're seeing that in his second term too, he will sever relationships with people that he thought were allies once they no longer seem useful to him. So we saw it, he chewed through generals like crazy in his first term. In his second term, he's already had a severed relationship with Elon Musk. And so it's not unreasonable to say, like, Trump thought highly of Putin and now he doesn't. And for whatever reason, that relationship is severed.
Yeah, it's. I mean, to be clear, I don't want to make it seem like they're it's all chummy and like a sort of normal relationship. But the emphasis is that Trump saw Putin as a strongman and someone who he'd like to sort of resemble or emulate to a certain extent in his what he'd like to achieve in, say, the US or something like that. Mm-hmm. There's often been, magazines like The Economist or even Time, I think, had one where they've put strongmen together, and Trump has sort of been on the periphery with Putin in the center because he's like the stand-up strongman. But, it's Putin's got a tough time at the moment, and I do want to come to the bigger macro outlook later on in the conversation, maybe in part 2. But when we look at the economy right now, you talk about this a lot in your videos. What is Trump's goal here? Is he going to try and overheat the Russian economy even more, or what do you think his strategy is?
Yeah, if you take his strategy on the surface, that seems to be what he's trying to do: bring down the Russian war machine without actually being tough on the Russian war machine, doing what Western leaders have done for years, which is let's attack the Russian economy and bring it down and hope that actually eventually brings down the Russian war machine. And it's not a bad strategy. It does work. But the problem is it takes time, and it is probably not the strength that needs to be portrayed here over 3 years into the war. It made sense at the beginning, see how it happens. And it's still better than nothing now, right? But there also needs to be some direct intervention against the Russian military machine. Trump, obviously, that seems a bridge too far for him. So the strategy seems to be, let's make that economic collapse happen even faster. And how that will ultimately play out is anybody's guess. There's a whole lot of theories that there may be ulterior motives here. And of course, there's always theories on that when it comes to any actions of a U.S. president. But that does seem to be the direction things are going now, just economic pressure.
Yeah, but do you not think, to be devil's advocate, that there's constantly another day goes by where everyone's, the Russian economy is about to collapse or Putin's about to, kick the bucket, and it's like, guys, as much as wishful thinking as we'd like, the Russian economy is more resilient than that. Sanctions take ages to work, if at all. What do you say to those sorts of counter arguments?
Yeah, I hear the counter argument, and sometimes I think the problem is people over exaggerating what analysts are actually saying versus the analysts actually being wrong. So when I listen to serious analysts, and of course there's people, dime a dozen YouTube videos that say Russia's economy is going to collapse tomorrow. When I hear serious analysts, they don't, put a date on it. They don't say it's going to happen tomorrow. They say this is the trend. This is the direction things are going, and it can't last forever. And I would say that's objectively true. We don't know the tipping point for the Russian economy, but we know it's just simple math. This is a wartime economy. They are chewing up resources on the battlefield. And even, if you believe that they're still getting a lot of oil revenue, and everybody has to concede that it's not as much as they were getting before the war. So their revenues have gone down, their expenses have gone up. It's just common sense math. Eventually, that will reach ahead. We know the mechanisms, too, that Russia has been using to keep their economy propped up this long, and we know that those mechanisms are decaying. So we know that prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Putin had saved up a massive war machine following the fact that the Western world had put sanctions on him in 2014 when he invaded and annexed Crimea. So he tried to prepare the Russian economy for an eventuality of sanctions and an eventuality of high expenses. And that has been what has really kept the Russian war machine going as long as it has. They were sort of prepared. But they're eating down that savings account rather than actually producing new economic activity to fund their war. And that's reflected very obviously by the fact that they have very high inflation rates in Russia and very high central bank interest rates to try to curb that inflation. And so all of the signals say the Russian economy is not doing well and it won't last forever. Nobody knows how long it can actually last, particularly because we can't really trust the data that we're getting out of Russia. And so, attacking the economy, it will accelerate that process. But again, we don't know where the finish line is. Is it in a year? Is it in 2 years? Is it in a month? It's hard to say.
Yeah, we had a recent conversation with an economic historian, sanctions specialist on the channel, and he was emphasizing that sort of, yes, sanctions are annoying or frustrating, but they're also the most publicized sort of policy tool in the toolbox, so to speak. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of disproportionate emphasis put on them, say in the media or in the political narratives that you hear. But, what has Russia been able to do in your mind that is quite effective? The central banker of the central governor of the Bank of Russia, right? She's done an incredible job navigating this, but even I think she's run out of patience, let alone options.
Yep. Yeah. It's an excellent point. And we saw recently, at this economic conference in Russia, while Putin tried to put on a good front and say the GDP was growing, et cetera, you had a lot of very senior people when it comes to analyzing the Russian economy within Russia itself, giving signals that it wasn't doing well. We heard the R word recession, warning that a recession could come in Russia. We heard the head of one of the largest banks in Russia saying, we haven't had an investment project all year. Which, how can you say your GDP is growing if the most important investment bankers aren't having any investment projects? It doesn't make sense. So I mentioned this because you ask, what is Russia doing that's effective? And really the most effective tool they have in their toolbox is their control over information inside of Russia, to where they can run massive inflation and they can control that narrative within inside of Russia and tell people it's all okay. Look, our economy is growing. It's no problem. Most people within Russia don't have the economic education to understand what's actually going on. And that really curbs the effects of inflation, because the biggest effect of inflation is when people realize it's happening and change their behaviors in extremes, run on banks and things like that. And so they've been able to control the narrative, and they still are to a large extent, but eventually the force does become overwhelming and the economic factors become too big to ignore, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. The International Economic Forum, if I presume that's the one you're referencing in St. Petersburg. I mean, even I did a video on that because Putin's statements or first admittance that it was not looking good, plus the fact that they might have to review defense spending in a couple of years. That's quite seismic. I mean, Putin doesn't say his stuff unless his back is up against a wall. And often when he's most quiet, we know that he's most up against it, like we saw with the Wagner mutiny or other examples. And I think that the Russian economy really is facing a unprecedented moment. And I don't like to overhype things unless it genuinely deserves it. But, what would that actually mean then if we want to play crystal ball, foreshadow or whatever? Like, fragmentation of the Russian economy, the elites flying out, Putin, run on the banks? What would that look like? Sort of, surely it wouldn't be the same as the 90s, would it?
Who knows how it will culminate? We can look at historical examples and see a lot of ways it has culminated, and it could be one of any of those or a combination. You mentioned the 90s. It could be a Soviet Union style collapse, although that would involve the collapse of the Putin regime. So there has to be other factors there as well. When we look at China, one of the things that brought down the Chinese empire was when they ceased to be able to pay their soldiers. And obviously that was a priority, but they just couldn't do it. So that could happen to Russia as well. Big reason people are fighting for Russia right now is specifically for the money. And so if that money is no longer on offer, current soldiers may turn against their commanders, their country in bitterness. And we point to the Wagner mutiny. It's not a crazy idea, but also they would just be unable to recruit future soldiers if there was a lack of confidence that they were actually going to get paid, since that's the main reason people join the military. So that'll be one of the biggest effects in seeing how that plays out if the Russian war machine runs out of bodies because they're not being able to convince people to join them, not even for money. That becomes a problem, and people will say, well, Putin could just turn to conscription, but you have to ask, why hasn't he done that already? Obviously, he sees that as a major fear factor. It could be the elites, to move to a different possibility, it could be the elites turning against Putin more severely and kind of intervening to preserve what is left of their fortunes. We see some signals that that might happen, and that's probably why so many Russian elites tend to fall out of windows. That's how Putin tries to control for that possibility. He wants to create a lot of fear at every level of society, especially among the elites who can actually, kind of step in and do something against him. So it's impossible to say how it will ultimately play out, but there's a lot of possibilities, and none of them are good. None of those possibilities, or very few of those possibilities, look like the most dramatic possible picture of just complete, Russian society completely stopping to function at every level. But that could also happen.
Yeah, well, that's why I often take a step back from the alarmism, because whilst there is the possibility, of course, this is the guy that a lot of autocrats model themselves on, right? Putin is the textbook individual or case study of how to centralize power and create such a effective network or web of loyalists underneath him. The keys to power, be it the military, the law enforcement, or the money. And it's his ability, I think, to still sidestep or navigate the situation by obviously making a lot of floors very slippery. Those windowsills must be very very precarious indeed. But I guess, so what does that mean then? How do we know when it really begins becoming, push comes to shove? In all your time of studying Russia, the war with Ukraine, what signals do we see that come out of Putin and his mindset or his vocabulary, or we don't?
Well, we already see the signals. Putin's calculus isn't primarily an economic calculus. The economic piece is a piece of his overall method of control. I already mentioned the people falling out of windows, and that is a signal that push is coming to shove. Putin is losing control of the economic lever, and so he's tightening other levers. We've seen signals of Putin saying that he is going to lower the Russian military budget. Who knows if that's actually going to happen, but he has felt compelled to actually go before the Russian public and make that statement, which means he fears what the Russian public thinks about the economic crisis. And at least with his words, he wants to try to assuage those fears, probably because he fears what could happen if people get too upset about the economic crisis and what they might do. And so that's a signal that things are moving in that direction. How do we know it's actually happened? Well, who knows, but we'll know when we know, right? There's not going to be a question. It might be as dramatic as Putin falling out of power.
Some people say it's a slow-moving car crash. Other people say it's boom, and then it just suddenly there. Other people say it's gonna, it's really rapid and dramatic and fireworks and stuff. I personally think it's a bit of a slow-motion collapse in this instance. But so you're the same. It's sort of lots of cracks, and then it just sort of implodes or something.
The fall is slow until it isn't. There. We saw that with the Soviet Union. People were saying, maybe it'll collapse someday, but it's not going to collapse any time within the next decade. And then it literally fell the next month. And I see that kind of with Russia too. It's their ability to control the narrative is remarkable, but at some point they won't be able to anymore.
And obviously, this goes beyond just the economic implications of the war on Russia. There is the emphasis on, well, I guess it says a subset, but the impact of on pensions and sort of imbalance across the country, right? If you've ever studied economic geography, viewers, then you'll know how badly Russia has it. The US has it great because it's got two borders either side with great access to maritime routes. It has two friendly neighbors, so it doesn't have to worry about being invaded. Russia, it's got multiple weak points, entry points across, adversaries. It's got a terrible northern border in terms of and weather and just generally The topography is terrible. So, like, how much do you think that plays into all of this being Russia? If you've ever read Prisoners of Geography, it's a really good book about just the
Great
simple.
book.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Highly recommended.
So I guess how I'd approach that question, we're thinking about Russia's economic future then. And I guess if you were to zoom out and instead of looking at this war and everything that's happening to Russia's economy on a year by year, a month by month basis, and you were to imagine us looking back in history, from a historical perspective, we'd probably say Russia's economy has already collapsed in the sense that they have lost almost all of their national economic advantages. Pyotr just mentioned you just mentioned the geography and how it's been so limiting to Russia throughout history, and it's totally true. They have a ton of land, but it's very difficult to use it because it's so bitterly cold. They have to build up oil infrastructure because oil and gas are some of the only useful things to them, but that infrastructure is incredibly vulnerable to the cold. And so when they lose their customers, like in Europe, that causes huge problems. They have to shut down some infrastructure, which they already have. And they've also lost a lot of their customers permanently. People say, well, they sell to India and China still. And it's like, yeah, a little bit. But China's had opportunities to increase their economic trade with Russia vastly by building new pipelines. And China has said no. So Russia's economic future, their ability to recover from the current crisis, which depends on them selling their natural resources, it's not certain at all. And we're not even mentioning, alternative sources of energy and things like that. So their ability to project power, in half a century is probably not there at all. And it's going to be hard for them to recover.
Yeah, it makes me think of these ghost towns that you have in the Arctic Circle, places like Vorkuta, which used to be massively central coal mining towns in like Chukotka or the Soviet era, and it's like sort of Chernobyl in Ukraine, right? These cities that have just been abandoned, but that was purely because they were uninhabitable or because once it collapsed. And it shows you just how sort of disjointed the Russian economy is, because you've got like all these points, but they're not interconnected well enough, so they can leverage. And I guess that leads me to my other big question, which I really enjoyed your video on about the demographic decline of Russia. Obviously, depopulation is one of the biggest challenges for the globe, but Russia and the former Soviet states, especially, including Ukraine, to be fair, how does that play into the calculus or just situation in Russia?
Yeah, hugely. I want to follow up on a point you made, and then I'll answer the demographic question because I actually think it's really interesting. You were talking about ghost towns. In the United States, we have ghost towns too, around old silver and gold towns. And the difference is when you look at the United States, every time that we, developed a ghost town, we converted the prosperity that came from that resource into a new competitive advantage, and we kept growing. And so the United States advanced out of, an oil economy, an energy economy, to become a technology economy, and this and that. And so Russia has always failed to convert their competitive advantages into a new competitive advantage for the next era, primarily because their economy has been so centralized in the hands of so few people like oligarchs or czars, etc. And so they are more interested in just extracting the wealth from these systems. They don't have an incentive to innovate and create new ways of building wealth. And so that's what makes Russia especially vulnerable as they lose wealth from their resources, and old resource towns become ghost towns. So sorry for that tangent. Now let me answer your question.
No, I think it's really wrapped. It's really fascinating. It deserves a deeper dive for sure.
Yeah. And to answer your question about the demographics, though, of course that plays in hugely. Putin for decades has said that the demographic crisis is Russia's biggest problem. So this is not like Western propaganda, even though I'm constantly told that by Russians in my comments. It's Western propaganda. Putin himself, for decades leading up to the war in Ukraine, has said that Russia has a massive demographic crisis and they need to solve it. Now that they're at war with Ukraine, he seems to not want to mention that anymore, probably because he's given up on it. He doesn't think it's solvable. Russia's people, they're not having children for obvious reasons because it's a society of despair. Why would you want to bring children into that? And even if you did want to, a lot of people can't afford to because there's no opportunities for them. And so that feeds into the demographic crisis. And then you have the young men dying far younger ages than in Europe, or the United States, due, primarily to rampant alcoholism and other issues related to that. that I'm talking about before the war, and now we have the war, of course. And so when you look at this war in Ukraine, let's just say in a worst case scenario for the West, Russia, quote unquote, wins the war. Who knows how long they have till collapse? All they've done is bought themselves a few decades or so, because they don't have already enough young people in their society to pay for the pensions. They don't have enough young people to work in the society to kind of keep the empire going. And a lot of people say that that's the reason Russia attacked Ukraine in the first place. They were hoping to kind of capture Ukrainian territory, but also Ukrainian people, and kind of use Ukrainian population numbers to boost their population and maybe go on for further conquests, kind of classic imperialism, to try to fix their internal demographic problem because they couldn't fix it through other means. And so what we see is there's no situation where Russia wins and is like a super relevant force on the global map in the next century. It's just, at least when we look at the indicators and the things that we can measure today.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I did demography being my specialty. Russia was somewhere that I was pretty fascinated by, and I think that what people don't appreciate is, yeah, in the short term, sure, they can win the war, right? But how are you going to sustain that holding of the territories that you have acquired,
Exactly,
or whatever, right? Absorbed. If Ukraine is savvy enough, or Europe is savvy enough, then you can see them retaking it in the future, right? Okay, Russia controls it in the short to medium term of a couple of decades, but in the longer term, if they don't have the capacity, once Putin's out of the picture, you have an internal situation in Russia, right? They're not going to be able to hold on to these territories, and then it's open game. And that's why people talk about China and its interests in Manchuria, for example, and all sorts of things we can talk about. But like, what do you therefore think is Putin's mindset then?
when we try to interpret Putin's mindset, I've always found it fascinating to hear what people around Putin were saying about what he was doing leading up to the war in Ukraine. It gives you an insight into him.
Right.
And it was kind of during this COVID era, Putin is kind of locked in these classic Russian empire buildings. You've got the Kremlin and things like that. And people close to Putin said he basically segregated himself from everybody. He isolated himself from everybody, is a better word. And he would go down to the archives and study Russian history. And I really think that this guy who's been in power for several decades, who's studying the history of the Russian Empire, got in his mind a delusional mindset of making his mark on history. He wanted to expand the Russian Empire again to its former glory. And I think he thought that would be easy, right? He goes into Ukraine, he takes it in a couple days, a couple weeks, and then that gives him a launching ground to attack the West. And maybe, if you throw him a bone and you say maybe he believes his own delusional things that he says that, Russia is morally superior to the West and all this, maybe he actually believed that he had some kind of destiny. And it seems increasingly like Putin is this guy who is chasing a lost destiny, a destiny he can no longer claim, but he can't stop pursuing it, because that would be not only admitting defeat, admitting failure, but it would also probably cause him to lose his position in his society. And that's why he keeps pushing forward in Ukraine. It's not because objectively, from a strategic standpoint, he stands a chance of winning, but emotionally, when you think of the reason he started the war in the first place, how can he stop? And he'd probably be willing to spend unlimited lives to leave a mark on history if there's even a chance of him doing that. Similar to, Adolf Hitler, he fought to the end, even when it was very clear that the Germans were going to lose at some point. He just kept the German people fighting until they were utterly defeated.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I've always thought Putin to be pretty pragmatic. But after that essay he wrote 4 years ago about the Ukraine relationship in history, clearly over the time he's been leader, he's become a lot more ideologically driven, or just become a lot more established in his thoughts. And there's debate around whether he wanted all of Ukraine or parts of it. Personally, in my mind, I think he wanted to create a vassal state in Ukraine overall, but to physically annex and occupy, or whatever, absorb Novorossiya, which is the part of south and eastern Ukraine, which was part of the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great and this at the 1800s. So that physically, because also that turns Ukraine into a rump state, like Hungary or Budapest, Bulgaria after the First World War. He gets full unprecedented, or what's the word, unmatched control of the Black Sea, lots of resources around there. It sort of fills in a lot of different things I think that Putin would have wanted. Is that kind of all irrelevant to you in the current scheme of things and the direction that we're in?
Are those objectives irrelevant now? Is that what you're saying? Has he just kind of changed his mind on those objectives, or
does it matter what he originally may have thought or wanted, and the realities of the wars they've changed in the past 3.5 years are what matter really?
It may or it may not. If we take the view that this is a man chasing destiny and a name in the history books, maybe there is a chance where he thinks that he will still achieve his objectives, as delusional as that might seem to us. We're not him. We're not people who started a war, and so we got to get into that mindset a little bit. There's another perspective where, as you say, though, the original objectives might be irrelevant. He might, at this point, just be trying to hold on to his place in power as long as he can, and he can't do that by ending the war. So, whether or not he achieves his actual objectives, he's just going to continue the war because, for the time being, as we've already talked about in this video, he has control over that narrative. And maybe he's thinking, maybe at some point China will step in and help me and save me. I think that's delusional, but maybe he's thinking it. Maybe he's thinking North Korea will step in a bigger way and help me. And maybe there's a chance that this still works out. Obviously, he was thinking maybe I can get the United States off the board in a major way when Trump came into power. And that was a major discussion for a long time. And now that's off the board. But maybe he's looking at other options as well.
Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Will's trying to come on board. You'll have to join us in part 2 to find out. See you later, everyone.